Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Dublin West Community Church to our sermon this morning at the end of May. We're still in lockdown, having to do virtual church, and we're going to continue this morning with our series on the book of Job. So we've spent 4 weeks so far looking at Job. It's a tricky little book in the Old Testament, but it's pretty interesting as well. So we've been looking at Job's struggle. Really, he's gone through an awful amount of things. Tragedy has struck him, and then we get to see how he works through that. All these speeches, these dialogues between him and his friends, talking to God, longing for change, longing for someone to come and help him in his situation. We see times of depression, I think, for Job, and it's fair to use that term. He talks in chapter 3 of cursing the day of his birth, in chapter 6 of wishing that he was dead. So things have gone really deep down for him as he struggles through what has happened. And so today we're getting to the end of the book, to the last 5 chapters. In chapters 38 to 41, in those 4 chapters, what we have is God speaking. We have as close to an answer as we're going to get. We never get the full answer that we're looking for if the answer is why. And I mean, that's if it's the answer to that question. And that is certainly the question most of us ask, is the why question. We don't quite get the answer to that, but we do get an answer from God here. God speaks twice in these 4 chapters, and he's speaking challenging Job. Mightn't always seem that pastoral, but he challenges Job in the midst of what is going, saying on, I will question you, and you will answer me. After these 20 chapters and more where Job has been questioning God. So, what answer do we get? In the first speech, it's chapters 38 and 39. What God is saying is, you don't have my wisdom. You do not have my wisdom to ask these type of questions. So the initial question, how God starts off his speech is he says to Job, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Plans there is the word counsel or design. You're saying you're coming to question my design of the world, how I have decided to design it. And God is not happy with that. So that's the topic here. And what God does in his speech to answer Job is he brings him on this virtual tour of the universe, this virtual tour of the cosmos. In chapter 38, he goes through the earth, the sea, and morning time, the underworld, light, various weather patterns. We have snow, storm, rain, and clouds, and various constellations in the sky. He goes through all of those. And the point as he goes through these in this tour of the universe is to show that Job doesn't have the answer to these things, because he does it by accompanying it with these questions, these rhetorical questions where the answer is no. They're questions to Job of do you know? Were you there? These impossible questions. So 38 verse 4, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Answer is you weren't there. We go on. Have you ever given orders to the morning? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? And the answer to all of them is no. And God is pointing out to Job, you don't know what I know. You haven't been there. You haven't created. You haven't done this. You can't really question my design. Chapter 39, he comes to the animals. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Again and again, the answer is no. God's point is that the world that he's made, the universe, is vast and complex. Tell me if you understand. You don't. In verse 7, he points out that when he created the world and the stars in the sky and the angels, then they celebrated for joy. They were happy with what God has made. Is Job saying that he knows better than them, than the angels or the stars? Is that his point? Because surely that can't be right. The irony of what God is doing here is perhaps most clearest in verse 21. Surely you know, for you were already born. You have lived so many years. This is God's point. We could put this point into our own time by talking about parts of our world which we don't understand now. In modern knowledge, this is written against cosmological knowledge of 2,500 years ago. If we put in today's terms, with regards to gravity, with regards to the human body and cells, etc., what would God say? The Babylon Bee is a website, satirical news site, a Christian one. There's one in Ireland, Waterford Whispers, which I love, which I go to when I can remember. This is an American one with a Christian tinge to it. And this is an entry it had on its site, which I think is playing on the book of Job. The headline of this article a few years ago was this: "What has God ever done for me?" asks man breathing air. You know, the man's actually breathing God's air as he's asking this question. And the article continues in the first paragraph. Sources confirmed on Tuesday that local freethinker Jared Olson called into question the absurd idea that God had ever done anything for him, all while inhaling oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide in a complex process well beyond his mind's capability of understanding in its entirety. We ask these questions, but yet we're ignorant. And that is God's point in this first speech. Job has insufficient knowledge to ask these questions of God's design of the world. God's perspective is bigger, and Job has to accept his ignorance. That's his main point. And a few other small points just on these chapters here is that when God is answering this question and pointing out the lack of wisdom, his focus on creation is about how he set up his world. And it's as if God is saying that this is how the world works. And this is how I've made the world work. It's about the design of the world. So when he talks about the earth's foundations, which he set up, or holding back the sea behind closed doors, he's talking about past events, his design, his setup of the world. When he talks about the weather, he's talking about how what we would call natural laws operate. So he's not talking about his micromanagement, minute by minute, small event by small event, but by how the world works. I think that's another important thing to know. And also there's the sense that his world, his creation, is not just based on the principle of justice. Now, obviously, justice is part of who God is and is very important to God, but it's not just based on that. At the example of the weather, when the rain falls even on the uninhabited desert. So rain is not just a curse or a blessing based on being unrighteous or righteous. It's not just based on that principle of justice. It's also just for his world. It's wisdom and design of God's world. And for the uninhabited desert, for creation itself, that rain falls. And that's another point. So how does this go for Job? Job is coming through this traumatic time, and God speaks in this way that you don't have the wisdom to question. And we have Job's response after this first answer from God, and it doesn't really seem to be enough for Job. He doesn't respond well enough in that first bit. He hasn't got an answer. He's come, in many ways, looking for the answer to the why question, as we often do, and he doesn't get that direct answer. Some people, as we've talked about already in the series, read the book of Job thinking that there's a bargain between God and Satan, that adversary character in chapter 1. We've argued that that's not Satan, and there is no bargain. And I think that's shown here because God doesn't point to that, bring the character of the adversary back into the equation here, because that is not the answer. No direct answer is given. And Job seems to come up short in his response. It's a hard thing for him to take this in. He does put his hands over his mouth. He's silent in some way, and then he confesses that he's unworthy, but he doesn't recant from what is previously said. It hasn't gone far enough for him, this answer. And I think we can relate to that. I can certainly relate to that. And if I look back at my toughest times in life, how hard it can be, and you wonder where God is, and you wonder why life is like this, and why you left in this position where things are not working out and things are so tough, and there seems to be no answer. And I'm sure if I look back, there were people talking to me about the wisdom of God, and of His world, how it's been set up, and how it will come to pass. But that didn't bring that much comfort at the time. So I can relate to Job's struggles here. So let's move on to chapters 40 to 41. This is the second talk that God gives to Job in seeking an answer. And it starts off on the question of justice. Justice. Would you discredit my justice? That's what God says to Job, because that's what Job has been doing. Job's issue in responding to the friends is that he's innocent. I'm innocent. I haven't done anything wrong. So God must be unjust. And he makes accusations towards God about his justice. He's discrediting his justice. Now, it's a funny place that God goes here in the conversation, because he ends up getting this conversation about two mythological creatures, two of these cosmic monsters, Bahamut and Leviathan. And it's sort of hard to know quite what he's doing with them. And it seems a funny place to go for the question of justice. George Bernard Shaw, the famous Irish author, playwright, has reported to have said about these chapters, if I complain that I am suffering unjustly, it is no answer to say to me, can you make a hippopotamus? And that sort of, it's a funny place for God to go, and that seems to be what he's doing. He's talking about these mythological creatures, be they a crocodile or a hippo or some version of mythological version of those. And what has that got to do with anything? Now, the traditional view on these creatures is that they were pictures of evil in the ancient world. And God is saying there's evil here. In the world, evil exists. Now, reading this week, preparing, I saw some other views from a number of quarters saying that it's not evil per se, and actually there's no particular verses in these chapters saying that these creatures are evil, but that rather they are disordered. They represent disorder in God's creation. If you remember in creation in the Garden of Eden, the garden was to expand. Adam and Eve were to bring the rule and the goodness of the garden to other parts of the world. So there was disorder outside the garden. And these animals might be dangerous, disorder, but not evil. But I don't think it matters that much which view we take on this, because the point is about power and control of these forces. Whether they're evil or disorder, do you have power over them? So straight after the question of justice in verse 8, God goes to the question of power. He challenges Job. Do you have an arm like God's? Do you have the muscle, the strength that I have to control these creatures and to control these forces of evil or disorder in the world? He challenges Job. Verse 11, unleash the fury of your wrath. Okay, you're questioning me. If you want to be in control of this world, then unleash your wrath. Because you need power and wrath or judgment to bring justice to this world. So I think I would go to this place where when the question is justice, I'd be expecting this conversation about making the right decisions, about moral decisions about God's world. But instead, God goes to power, to the ability to enforce decisions, enforce justice. There is evil, there is disorder in the world. It's part of where we live. It's the water we swim in. And so the question becomes who can control or restrain these forces. And God is saying he can. And this is what the animals, these monsters, are pictures of. Bahamut. The challenge again to Job is about control. Verse 24, can anyone capture it by the eyes or trap it and pierce its nose? So can you control it, Job? Can you control this monster, this Bahamut? And the answer is obviously no. He can't control it. But God can. God can control it. Verse 19 says this, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. So God can control Bahamut and you can't. That's what it's about, being able to control these forces. And it's the same with Leviathan. The first 9 verses of chapter 41 start with all these challenges again to Job about being able to control and restrain Leviathan. Verse 1, can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook? And it continues in that vein, can you control him? And the answer is no. But God can. Yahweh can. Verse 10, who then is able to stand against me? You can't control Leviathan. Can you control me? Implication is that I am more powerful than him and I can control him. So it's about control and power. What God is saying is there are forces of evil and disorder in this world. They are there. They haven't been eliminated. And justice requires controlling them. It requires power. And who has that power? I do. And you don't, I'm afraid, Job. Evil is on a leash. It's constrained but not eliminated. And if Job has insufficient power to control these forces, then he's going to have to trust in someone who does have power. And that is, of course, God or Yahweh. And so you see this overlap in the two talks that God does. Job doesn't have the wisdom to question God's design of this world, and he doesn't have the power himself to control justice. So what's he left with? And the implicit message throughout the chapters in both talks is that he's left with trust. That what he has to do is come to a place of trusting God, because he can't fulfill that role himself. He's not God. Let God be God. And trust in God, who himself has the wisdom and the power. If you don't have all the facts before you, what you have to do is trust in the wisdom of the judge to make the right judgment. And likewise with power. And that's what Job has to do. And we get some sort of ending to the story where Job, this does work for Job. He's able to change his demeanour by the end. And his second response in chapter 42, we see that he changes. And he talks in a way where he accepts his ignorance. He accepts his ignorance. Verse 3, chapter 42, verse 3, says this, surely I spoke of things I did not understand. He accepts his own ignorance. And it seems that key in this journey has been this encounter with God. Verse 5, my eyes had heard of you, but now my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. He has seen God. He has finally had a direct encounter, a one-on-one encounter with God, where God has come in. And that seems to be the turning point for Job. And by the end of this encounter, the second speech of God has been enough. He hasn't got the answers. That's the interesting bit. He hasn't got the answers that he sought. Or maybe the answers that we as readers come to when we look at the book of Job. He hasn't got those answers to the why question. But now he's able, having had met God, he can trust him and live with the questions that he has instead. That's interesting. And I can relate to that. I think of my own times of struggle when things were difficult. And what was a turning point for me was that God directly spoke into it. I remember a day praying and fasting and God speaking. And in that speaking, God didn't give the answers to the why question what I was looking for. Instead, he spoke about the future and gave hope that it wouldn't go on forever. And I guess most significantly, what it was saying was God was saying, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm active, I'm in the situation, I know what's going on, you're not alone, as he spoke into it. And that's, I think, what happened for Job at the end of this. And then he is able to trust in this God. And I wonder how much part of that journey that Job went through, the whole book, was the fact that he talked it out with God as he went. He talked out his laments and what was going on with the friends and before God. He had moments of asking God, I just want an encounter with you where I can put my case before you. He desired a mediator who would come and enable him to go before God. He longed for this encounter with God, and he got one. In the epilogue at the end, in verse 7, God speaks about the friends and about Job. And if you remember, when we looked at them, we saw that they both made the same mistake. They had very different viewpoints. The friends were saying, Job, must be your fault, you're getting punished, your fault, you've sinned, you've done something wrong. Job was like, no, I'm innocent, therefore it's God's fault, and God's not just. And underlying those different views was the same assumption that God's justice always happens in this world, that everything happens for a reason. And that wasn't true. But when God speaks here, he doesn't just say you were both wrong. He says this in verse 7. I'm angry with you and your two friends because you've not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Job has spoken truth. And somehow in the dialogue that he's saying, part of that was truth. Spoken truth about how unfair it was. It was unfair. You were innocent. We knew that from chapter 1. That was true. And the unfairness, your innocence, the depth of your feeling, what the impact on you, that's your truth. And you brought that before me. And so we're encouraged to lament, just as the Psalms give us words to do that with. We're encouraged to bring that before God. But it does seem in verse 6, it says that Job repented. He's repented of something that he's spoken of. So it does seem that he crossed the line at some stage. I think for me, my guess around that is from lamenting, which was okay, he crossed the line into direct accusation of God. Chapter 40 verse 2 talks about accusing God. And I think that's what he repented of as he crossed the line. But this talking it out with God is commended here for Job. And it led to this encounter with God, this sense of now I see you. My eyes have seen you. And in that encounter then finally he was able to see that he's spoken too much. He doesn't have any answers. He's still living with the questions. But now he's able to trust in the living God. Amen.